Welcome to Literary AF Podcast.
Hello and welcome to our special podcast coming at you live from Austin, Texas. It's Jane Austen. It's Literary AF.
Yeah.
We're talking about Jane Austen.
Yes.
We're not in Austin, Texas.
No.
We are not live.
No.
We're both currently dead and being reanimated by a necromancer.
Right.
No, we're a podcast.
Yes.
My name is Sheldon.
I'm Danny.
And we are going to talk to you today about a book.
Books.
By Jane Austen.
Yes.
That part was right.
Yes.
And that book is called...
Persuasion.
Yeah. And Danny recently read this one.
Last week I re-listened to the audiobook.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I read this about a year ago, I believe.
Okay.
According to Goodreads, I read this in January 2018, so about a year and a half ago.
There you go.
And Danny really likes this one, right?
Yeah, this one's my favorite out of the Jane Austen works.
In the Jane Austen verse.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be so cool if instead of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it was the Jane Austen Cinematic Universe.
Cinematic Universe. Yeah, I could get behind that.
Can you imagine an Avengers type movie, but it's like Elizabeth and Anne and Sense and Sensibility? I can't remember her name.
Marianne and Eleanor. Yeah.
Anyway, so today we are going to do a breakdown of the book.
Yeah.
And then next episode we're going to talk a little more in depth, I think, about it.
Yeah, about because we have different opinions on this book.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the movies too.
Yep.
Because there's 2 movies that came out for this. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you probably have a better grasp on it than I do because you've read it more recently than me.
Right.
So do you want to start with the plot?
Sure.
Okay.
I don't have a book to reference on me, so I will just have to go with what I can remember off the top of my head.
Okay.
Don't yell at me if I get these informations wrong.
I also have the Spark Notes open so I can
Okay.
correct you if you're wrong.
Judge me on the fly.
And get really mad, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, the book starts with Walter Elliot going through his family history book kind of thing.
Oh yeah, the baronetcy.
Yeah. And it just it starts off by explaining that he's super vain.
Yeah.
And him and his oldest daughter, that's like their defining character traits, is that they're super vain people. And then there's like an offhanded, he's got 2 other daughters, but they're not really anything compared to him and his eldest daughter, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like this beginning. It's a good mislead for what the book's actually about.
Yeah, I actually made a note about that. Like, Anne does not become the main character until chapter 4.
Yeah. Like
the beginning of chapter 4 is kind of where it like switches off of Walter and Elizabeth and to be like, but there's this other daughter who, etc. And then it kind of becomes her story, but it takes like 4 chapters to get there, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and it's cool too because Anne is so much different than like all the rest of her family.
Yeah. So
like having it slowly positioned to her is like a really kind of fun way or kind of interesting way to start the book. Yeah. And I found I had a hard time getting into this book because I didn't like the family. But then once it focused on Anne, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I like this. Yeah. This is charming.
Yeah. So Walter has been living out of his means, basically, and the family has no more money to sustain their way of life. And they don't want to cut back on, like, anything. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, we need to get more money, but we're also not going to make any of these concessions. Yeah. Because we need to maintain our what do you call it? Our appearances.
Yeah. One thing that made me laugh, I watched the 2007 movie this morning just to refresh myself. Yeah. And one of the first lines made me laugh was Elizabeth says, they're like, oh, you have to cut back on your spending. And Elizabeth says, well, we already cut out all the unnecessary charities. Yeah. Like that was the only thing she could cut out.
So what they end up doing is after some convincing, I guess, from Anne and their friend, Lady Russell, and their other friend, who's a lawyer, whose name I forget.
Yeah, I don't
Hunter
remember
or something? Either way. They convince Walter to rent out his estate, basically, and move to Bath. Which, Anne Elliot hates Bath.
Yeah.
And I remember reading somewhere that Jane Austen also really hated Bath. So
that's weird, though, because, like, a number of her books take place in Bath, or at least they go to Bath.
Yeah.
Like, Northanger Abbey, like, half the book is in Bath.
Huh.
Yeah. But yeah, they're always talking about the pump house in Bath, and I always laugh about that.
And, who moves in? Colonel.
The Admiral.
Admiral.
Yeah.
Do you have his name? Can't remember his name.
Mycroft.
Croft. And his wife move in, and his wife is sister to Mr. Wentworth, who
yes.
Anne has a history with. Like 8 years prior, they had a very brief engagement, like they were in love, and her friend Lady Russell convinced her that she shouldn't marry him because he didn't have a lot of money, he didn't have like title or land or anything like that.
Yeah.
And then he went off to war and made a fortune, basically.
Yeah.
And now he's, I guess, worth something. So the Crofts move into the estate, which the name is completely escaping me right now.
Let's see if I can find it. Uppercross?
Yeah?
No, Uppercross is where Mary lives.
Oh.
Kellynch?
Kellynch Hall.
Kellynch, yeah.
Yeah. So the Crofts move into Kellynch, and Anne goes to stay with her sister Mary.
At Uppercross?
At Uppercross. Well, they, I guess, figure out the last bit of their affairs and stuff.
Yeah.
And her dad and Elizabeth go on to Bath without her.
Yeah.
And
Mary complains the entire time.
Oh yeah, Mary's a hypochondriac, and she's constantly like so sick.
Yeah.
And whenever people aren't paying attention to her, she gets sick again, kind of thing.
And she's also seems like the type who, like, she gets married super young.
Yeah. And
then she gets mad at everybody else for not, like, still paying attention to her as much as they did before.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's almost like she's chosen this whole new life for herself, but then gets mad that everyone from her old life didn't, like, come with her almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Anne stays with Mary. The thing about these Jane Austen books is there's a lot of repeat names.
Yeah.
Like, there's Elizabeth and Mary from Pride and Prejudice, and then they're also in this book, and it gets confusing.
And isn't Mary Ann from Sense and Sensibility?
Yeah, there's Mary Ann in Sense and Sensibility. There's, like, Edwards all over the place in all of the books.
So anyway, Mr. Darcy comes to visit.
Anne is staying with Mary, and she's like, I hope Wentworth doesn't show up. But, of course, Wentworth shows up at the Kellynch to visit his sister, and they run into each other, and there's, like, a really awkward moment, I guess, but they don't talk, really. They just kind of move on, and she's like, ugh, it's over, you know, I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
It's fine. It's fine.
It's fine.
It's fine. Just imagine Anne sitting in that room that's completely on fire.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah, basically that, yeah. What are their names? There's two other girls staying at the main house.
The Musgroves?
The Musgroves, like so there's the big Musgrove estate, and then Mary and her husband are staying at the
cottage.
The cottage on that estate. And the Musgroves have two daughters, Louisa and Henrietta. And these two daughters are, like, super into Wentworth.
Yeah.
And there's, like, a bit of, like, an argument going on between Mary and her husband over, like, which girl is going to win Wentworth in the end kind of thing.
There's I got the distinct impression that this is an area where there's a fair amount of, like, unmarried women and no eligible men. So like the second that Wentworth shows up, it's like boom, like these women are going into action.
There's ladies all over the place coming to meet Wentworth. And there's like I'm trying to remember the order of things.
Okay, well I'll just look at the spark notes here. Captain Wentworth proposes that they all take a trip to Lyme to go visit his friends.
Well, no, they go on a walk before that, though.
Oh, well. I thought we talked about that already.
No. Wentworth and Louisa and Henrietta and Mary and Mary's husband, whose name I cannot remember. I think it's Charles. Charles Musgrove. And Anne all go on a walk together. And there's another guy who I think Louisa was considering marrying, and they thought she was going to marry, and then the moment Wentworth showed up, like... Oh, yeah. She dropped him like a hot potato and focused on Wentworth, and I guess Louisa had talked her into going back to... What was his name?
It doesn't say on here.
Okay, well, he had like a parish or something, and so Mary talks about how he's like way below them or whatever, but it was good for... Is it Louisa?
It doesn't say on here any of that stuff. Unless that happens later.
No, because it happens pretty early on.
Does it happen before the injury?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because they go on the walk before, and then that's where there's like the carriages coming by, and they're all walking together, and everybody's like, oh no, we don't need a ride. And Wentworth is like, no, why don't you take Anne in the carriage with you? And he kind of like sends her off while the rest of them keep walking without her, kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
There's a conversation that happens in that where which sister is the one that falls and hurts herself, though?
That's Louisa.
That is Louisa?
Yep.
Okay, well, Louisa and Wentworth are like walking through the bushes, and Anne is kind of like listening in on their conversation. Mm-hmm. And they talk about how Anne had originally been proposed to by Charles Musgrove, mm-hmm. and she turned him down. I don't remember if they say why she turned him down, but then he turned around and ended up marrying Mary. Yep. And they talk about the Elliot pride, yep. which everybody's kind of known for.
Well, and in the movie, it's they say that it's because of Lady Russell's influence that Anne turned Charles down. But that's also the reason why she turned...
That's definitely why she turned Wentworth down.
Because in the movie, that was the moment... Because when... I think it's Louisa or Henrietta are telling this to Wentworth. Yeah. And then that's the moment when he realizes that that's why Anne turned him down as well.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to find a quote here. Actually, the quote I was looking for doesn't really work for this situation. Oh. But you were right. They did tell him that Lady Russell had convinced her to not marry Charles. Okay. So, there's that. Fun. After this walk, I guess they're on the way back when the carriage shows up with the Admiral and his wife. And there's like room for one more. And everybody's like, oh no, we're fine. We'll walk. It's okay. Yep. And Wentworth is like, no, Anne, get in the carriage. Why don't you go off with them, Anne? And it kind of feels like he's trying to get rid of her. Yeah. Which I think she actually interprets as he can see that she's tired and he's giving her an out, and she actually really appreciates it. Yeah. Which I don't know if that comes off in the movie. No. Well, I don't remember that exact moment happening in the movie. Mm-hmm. But I do remember reading that part. There's a lot of good back and forth between Anne and Wentworth. Yeah. Where you're not really sure how either of them really feels about each other after so long. Yeah. Because at times it feels like Wentworth doesn't care at all. He's so detached and flirting with the other girls. Yeah. But then there are times where it's oh, maybe he does still like her. And Anne regrets it, but at the same time she seems kind of smitten when someone else shows up. Should we get into that? Is that coming up? Yeah, that's coming up now. Okay. I think Wentworth talks about going to Lyme. Yeah. And the whole group is like, yeah, we'll go to Lyme. Let's go to Lyme. And they all head out together. And they meet Wentworth's friends. whose names I cannot remember.
Yep, me neither.
There's the married couple.
Yeah.
And then there's
the sad guy.
The sad guy. His name is Bancroft?
That sounds right.
Something like that. He's the sad man. Whose his betrothed had died a year before while he was out fighting the war.
She died?
Yeah.
I thought she left him for someone else.
Oh no, she died.
Oh, why does he talk then about how women are so fickle? He goes on about it. And Anne, like, rebuffs him.
Oh, because he's like, oh, I'm so sad a woman couldn't really understand how sad I am because my betrothed died, is basically what he's saying.
Oh, because he was
Anne is like, well, no. No.
He was sad in, like, a nice guy way.
Yeah.
And I thought it was like, oh, his fiance left him or married somebody else.
No,
but
she died while he was at sea.
She died. Classic fickle women, always dying.
And his betrothed was actually the sister to the people that he's staying with, whose names I cannot remember.
No.
And Anne, I guess they kind of like form a brief friendship. Anne and the sad guy. I wish I could remember his name for sure. Bancroft or something.
What about the other gentleman who Anne sees?
I think that's not till they're about to leave.
Oh.
Or just before. It's like the day before Louisa gets hurt.
Okay, yeah, because in this summary, it's all in one paragraph, so it's hard to tell.
Oh. Yeah, I don't think Bancroft's right, because that's not coming up on my search. Anyways, they, I guess, hang out at the beach a little bit. It's like just before Christmas, so it's kind of cold. But they walk around on these, I don't know what you call them, but like this stony level by the water. And
Benwick.
Benwick. All right. We were close.
Yeah.
And everybody has a good time. They have dinner. And then the next morning, I guess Anne meets him on the stairs that day, where she passes by this guy.
Yeah.
And he, like, does a double take.
Yeah.
And Anne is, like, super flattered, because it seems like he's totally into her.
Yeah, and he's, like, a handsome young gentleman.
Handsome, unknown man. And then the next morning, they see a carriage leaving the inn, and they see the handsome unknown man get into the carriage, and there's like they ask one of the servants who that was, and I think they say like a Mr. Elliot.
Yeah. And
Mary starts going, oh, Mr. Elliot, that has to be our cousin because he was so attractive, and is it Mr. Elliot, our cousin? He's awesome. He's great.
That's a thing that's like has changed so much over 200 years. Where it's like back then, it's like, oh, he's handsome and he's our cousin. Isn't that great? Whereas now it'd be like, oh, gross. I thought he was handsome, but it turns out he's my cousin. Yeah.
He's also Walter Elliot's heir.
Yes. So. Yes, because Walter only had daughters.
Yes.
If he died, his estate and his house wouldn't go to the daughters. It would go to Mr. Elliot.
Yes.
Yeah. And Sir Walter and him hate each other, right?
Yeah, because the original plan was for their cousin to marry Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. And then he got married to some lady with no title but who had a lot of money. Yeah. And then that lady died like a year or two before this book takes place.
Okay. Okay, can we get into the injury?
The injury, yeah. It's like their last day in Lyme, and they decide to walk along the shore, I guess, one more time. And Louisa is still, I guess, vying for Wentworth's attention.
Yeah.
And she's like, catch me, Wentworth, and jumps off these stairs. And he's like, okay, that's enough. And she's like, no, catch me again. And she runs up the stairs and then jumps off. But he doesn't catch her in time because he was too busy being like, no, don't do this. Yeah. And she jumps off anyways. And she lands on her head and, like, knocks herself out cold on these stones.
That was just a classic high dive onto stones.
Yeah. And everybody starts freaking out.
Yeah.
Except for Anne, who always maintains, like, a very level head in these situations. And so Anne has to be like, okay, you go get the doctor. You, like, don't touch her. Like, just stop. Stop screaming.
And Mary freaks out because Mary thinks she's going to have to stay with the girl. And Mary hates having to do anything.
Yeah. So they get her taken back to the house of Wentworth's friends.
Yeah.
And they get a doctor to see her, and a doctor's like, she looks okay, but we shouldn't move her. She should stay here in Lyme for a couple weeks while she's healing. She's still, like, out cold at this point.
Yeah.
And they decide everybody who's going to stay and who's going to go home. Because they need to send some people home. And the original plan was for Anne to stay. Like, Wentworth had asked specifically for Anne to stay because she knows what she's doing and she's capable.
Yeah. But doesn't Anne also think it's because Wentworth doesn't want to be around her? That he's, like, specifically asking her to stay away from him?
No, I don't think so. Because I think Wentworth was staying too.
Oh, I thought there was, like, she was worried because he asked her to stay while he was going, and then it ended up being that she went with him and then she was happy.
No, I don't think so.
It's been a long time. I might be getting stuff mixed together.
So the original plan is Anne is going to stay. And when Mary hears this plan, she's like, why does Anne get to stay? You know, I'm Louisa's friend. You know, I mean more to her than Anne does, so I should get to stay because I'm better. And then Mary ends up staying and Anne has to go home without everybody else. So she rides back with Wentworth, and it's like a quiet carriage ride for like 6 hours back to the estate. And they get Louisa's parents, and then they go back to Lyme. And then Anne is kind of on her own for a day or two before she has to go back to stay with Lady Russell. And then Lady Russell and her are going to go to Bath to be with Walter Elliot and her sister Elizabeth. And that kind of feels like the first half of the book, I guess.
Yeah. Because
the setting changes after that, and it feels like a separate thing going on, kind of. Anne and Lady Russell get to Bath, and when they're there, they find out that her cousin, Mr. Elliot, has gotten back on good terms with her father, Mr. Elliot. And he's, like, over visiting every day, and they're hanging out, and they're having a good time, and Elizabeth has, like, a crush on him, even though they're cousins. That's what people do.
Yeah, that was a thing for a long time in human history.
Yep. And there's also a lady staying with them, Mrs. Clay.
Okay.
And Mrs. Clay is a friend of Elizabeth's, and Anne has a suspicion that Mrs. Clay is trying to get with their father.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And Anne is like, does nobody else see this happening? Like, this is clearly what she's trying to do, but nobody believes her. And there is some important family in the city, and I can't remember their name, but it's really funny, and it gets me every time.
Yeah. Oh, Lady Dalrymple.
The Dalrymples are their distant cousins, who are basically... Oh, I forget what their status is, but they're really high.
Yeah, nobility is what it says.
Basically nobility, yeah. And so Walter Elliot is basically sucking up to the Dalrymples the entire time. Yeah. And that's, like, the most important thing, is impressing the Dalrymples. And there's a little bit of... Anne goes to see her friend, who lives in the poor side of town. Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith, and she's a widow.
She's a widow who used to be, like, rich, but her husband spent all their money on, like, gambling and stuff like that. And now she's poor, and she's sick, and she's basically confined to her house all the time.
Yeah.
And there's a scene where, like, Anne mentions to her dad and her sister that she's going to visit her friend.
Yeah. And
her sister's like, oh, who's she? That she's more important than, you know, us and the Dalrymples and she ends up being like really important later.
Yeah.
Because she has a nurse who
pays attention to all the gossip in town. Yeah.
She's a huge gossip, and her nurse like works for all the people in the city, so she hears like all the goings-ons. Then there is a letter from Mary, basically catching up on what was happening with Louisa and everything. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those, like, I can't imagine living in a time where everything was just letters. Where, like, everything you learn, I guess, is a week behind. You know? Because there's a delay.
Yeah, there's no phone calls or texts or email.
So, Anne gets this letter from Mary that is the first... She gets 2 letters stuffed into one envelope. Mm-hmm. And the first one is just like, oh, Louisa's doing pretty good. You know, we should be talking about me. Here's some stuff that's happened to me, but,
of course.
You know, etc.
A very classic Mary.
And then she gets the second letter open, and it basically says, you won't believe what happened. Louisa is getting married to, what's his face?
Benworth. Ben...
We just said this.
Ben Croft?
No.
Benwick.
Louisa's getting married to Benwick because he, I guess, had been spending a lot of time with her while she had been recovering over the last couple weeks. Mm-hmm. And they are in love now. And I guess that means Wentworth is out of the picture. And that kind of gives Anne, like, a new hope.
Yeah.
That he's on the table again. And with the letter, the Crofts... Is that what their name is? Admiral Croft? I think it was.
Yeah, they were the Crofts, yeah.
The Crofts have come into town, and Anne is hanging out with them again, and she actually, like, really enjoys their company. Mm-hmm. Like, compared to her family and stuff like that. Like, she missed having those friends.
Yeah.
And, I'm trying to remember what happens now.
We're getting pretty close to the end.
We're getting pretty close.
For time-wise, too, though.
Yeah. There's like a concert fundraiser thing happening, and she
goes with Mr. Elliot, doesn't she?
She goes with Mr. Elliot. Oh, before this though, they run into Wentworth.
Yes.
In a hat shop when it starts raining, and there's like a kind of awkward encounter, and then she leaves the shop with Mr. Elliot.
Yeah.
And then they run into each other again at this music thing, where she's sitting with the Dalrymples and Mr. Elliot and her family.
Yeah.
And Wentworth is also there.
Yeah.
And they have, like, a chat. And then he sees her talking to Mr. Elliot, and he gets, like, all jealous.
He gets all, leaves. Let's say, Mr. Darcy-ish and tries to leave.
And I guess, notices this. Like, she actually picks up on the fact that he's definitely kind of jealous of Mr. Elliot.
Yeah.
Which gives her, like, a new... It makes her feel even better about her chances, basically, if he's caring enough to get jealous of Mr. Elliot kind of thing. And then she's hanging out with the people from Lyme. Mm-hmm. And the one man kind of talks about how Benwick moved on from his fiancée, even though it's only been like a year since she died or something.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if they have this conversation in the movie.
No.
But in the book, this is where the conversation is, where they talk about, like, men and women and who feels harder than the other and who like stays in love longer kind of thing.
They do have this conversation in the movie, but it happens much earlier.
Right.
It happens during this trip to Lyme.
Yeah. This happens at the end of the book, and Wentworth is actually in the room writing a letter when they're having this conversation. Mm-hmm. And I can actually find a quote to this one because I did save it. If you just give me like 2 seconds to pull it up properly.
Okay, we'll give you exactly 2 seconds. Okay, readers, are you timing at home? Listeners, you're not reading this podcast.
It was the Harvilles, was the friends, Captain Harville and his wife.
Yeah, those ones, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here. "We shall never agree upon this question," Captain Harville was beginning to say when the slight noise called their attention to Captain Wentworth's hitherto perfectly quiet division of the room. It was nothing more than his pen had fallen down, but Anne was startled to find him nearer than she had supposed, and half inclined to suspect that the pen had only fallen because he had been occupied by them, striving to catch sounds which yet she did not think he could have caught. So basically he's, like, listening in onto their conversation where she talks about how, like, women love longer than men because men live harder lives, so if they had the same kind of emotional attachment that women did, like, it would just be too much or whatever.
Okay.
Is basically what they say. And from there, Captain Harville and Wentworth, like, leave because they have errands to run.
Mm-hmm.
And as she's, like, leaving, because they're having a party that night with the Elliots, and Anne's leaving to go get ready for that party, she basically gets ambushed by Wentworth, like, as she's walking up the door. And he just kind of stuffs a letter into her hand.
That's right.
And this letter is, like, it's one of the best letters, I think, in, like, romantic works that I think I've seen.
Oh, okay.
I saved the quote, but I think I'll read it next time, because we're getting short on time.
Yeah,
here,
so we'll finish up the plot and then we'll get more in depth on
I have some quotes saved for next time.
The next episode.
But basically the letter is like, I'm still in love with you, and I hope you still love me too, and I would really like to, you know, marry you, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And Anne reads the letter, and then she goes to track him down, and they have, like, a pleasant conversation where they, I guess, reiterate their feelings with each other, and they talk about what happened in the book.
Also, before this was, Anne finds out that Mr. Elliot was kind of planning on, like, that he was basically...
Was that before this?
Yeah.
Oh, it was.
Because she meets with Mrs. Smith beforehand.
Yeah, okay, that was before this. Like, just before.
What was the plan? That he has another woman that he's, like, planning on keeping as a mistress when he marries it?
So, originally, Mr. Elliot was planning on... He noticed that Mrs. Clay was trying to catch Anne's father, basically.
Yeah.
And if Mrs. Clay had a son, he would lose his chance at the title.
Yeah.
So his original plan was to step in and keep Mrs. Clay, like, distracted so that she wouldn't make a move on him.
Yeah.
And then he and Mrs. Clay actually start seeing each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they start hooking up. And his other plan was to marry Anne.
Yeah. He wanted to marry Anne. It says on here he wanted to... part of the agreement for marrying Anne was he wanted to say that Mr. Elliot couldn't remarry.
Right.
So Sir Walter couldn't remarry.
Right.
And also that he had previously screwed over Mrs. Smith, the widow.
Yeah, because he was friends with her dead husband. And
he was the executor of the will.
Yeah. And he didn't give her any of the money that she was due.
And in the movie, they simplify it to just that he's courting a different woman at the same time as Anne, and that he was planning on keeping that woman as a mistress when he married Anne.
Mrs. Clay.
It didn't say Mrs. Clay.
It didn't?
It was just some woman.
Because in the epilogue of Persuasion, it definitely says, like, he and Mrs. Clay both disappear from Bath and go to London together or something, so...
Very scandalous. All right, are we basically done? Is there anything else that happens?
That's pretty much it. Anne and Wentworth are back in love. And, they don't say much more than that. I don't think...
Cool. Well, we are a little over time.
A little bit.
So that's the general plot of the book. If you guys haven't read it, definitely suggest that you read it before next time, because we're going to be doing a little bit of a, like, in-depth kind of, like, our thoughts on it and some questions, and we're going to go through. The book
is really good.
Yeah.
It was not explained very well.
Yeah, we're
between the two of us.
No, we kind of got lost.
We got a little lost in the middle there. The book is really good.
Yeah, it's solid. It's you liked it more than I did, but I still enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It's very solid.
It's not a long read either. It's not, like, huge.
No.
The audiobook itself is about 9 hours, and the Kindle estimates that reading time is, like, 3 or 4 hours. So
yeah.
It wouldn't take you too long.
All right. Well, okay. So then, Danny, where can people find us?
People can find us on Facebook, Literary AF. We're also on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Literary AF. Mm-hmm. I'm on Twitter, LiteraryAFPod. Our Gmail is literaryafpod@gmail.com.
Great. And, yeah. So, whatever. All right. Since I nailed the outro, tune in next week and hear more about Persuasion.
Yeah.
And tune in 2 weeks where Danny is going to be reading the entire phone book by herself. All right. See ya.
Bye.